a shadow from the past, a letter unsigned, and a promise of vengeance whispered in widow's black, the sins of yesterday returning with chilling grace. When justice becomes a masked performance, whose grief is genuine and whose is merely an act, tonight you'll step into a mystery woven from silence, secrets, and sorrow. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. Excellent. Below is the full-length narrative script for the section titled The Hook from the Sherlock Holmes mystery, Sherlock Holmes and the Four Widows of Dublin, written in the precise tone and style of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, narrated by Dr. Watson. It was on a dull, grey morning in the early March of 1894 that I found myself once more seated by the fire in our familiar sitting room at 221B Baker Street. A soft drizzle coated the panes in a fine sheen, the kind that neither fell with commitment nor cleared with purpose. Holmes stood at the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his profile still as a sculpture against the light. There was in his bearing that morning a peculiar restlessness, an energy restrained, as though the storm within had not yet found a suitable case to justify its release. I had been perusing a medical monograph when Holmes turned to me abruptly. "We shall have company, Watson," he remarked. "Irish, late middle-aged, formerly of judicial profession, and in some distress of mind." I laid down the journal with a smile. "You've seen him, then?" "Not yet," Holmes replied, already reaching for his pipe. Moments later, a brisk rap echoed from the door below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's tread on the stairs and the familiar knock. Holmes gave a nod, and I opened the door to admit a tall, silver-haired gentleman whose countenance bore the fatigue of some sleepless burden. He clutched a black umbrella speckled with rain and bore a pair of worn kid gloves, one notably more weathered at the fingertips. "Lord Patrick Dwire," Holmes greeted him before the man could speak, "formerly of the Dublin Circuit Court. You have not slept well these past nights, and you arrived in London only yesterday via the morning steamer from Kingstown." The man froze at the threshold. How did you know?" Holmes gestured toward the umbrella. "A layer of salt crust near the ferrule suggests sea air. Your gloves are ink-stained on the right, consistent with a judge's marginalia. And your gait, slightly hesitant on the left, suggests an old injury. One that matches records I read years ago of the Dwire versus McClellan trial. Dwire entered slowly, as though reluctant to step fully into the clarity Holmes provided. "Mr. Holmes," he said at last, "I did not come here for amazement, but for help." Lord Dwire removed his overcoat with mechanical precision, his eyes never straying far from Holmes. Though clearly a man accustomed to command, he now moved with the uncertain air of one haunted by shadows of his own making. He seated himself across from Holmes and drew forth a slim envelope from his inner coat pocket. His fingers trembled slightly as he held it. "I am not a man given to flights of imagination, Mr. Holmes," he began, "but I confess I have scarcely slept these past 3 nights. There is something in this that I cannot explain." I observed the man more closely now. His skin, though weathered, was pallid beneath the eyes, and the knuckles of his right hand bore faint impressions, as if he had clutched something tightly for hours. Holmes leaned forward. "You may speak freely, Lord Dwire. You are not the first magistrate to seek refuge in logic." With deliberate care, Lord Dwire unfolded the paper within the envelope and placed it upon Holmes's desk. I leaned in slightly to read the slanted hand. Its ink faded at the edges, but legible still. "You judged wrongly once. Justice returns in widow's weeds. Soon you shall join the other 4. The signature was absent, the seal foreign. The postmark bore the familiar round stamp of Dublin, dated 4 days prior. "I received it at my club," Dwire said, his voice quieter now. No one saw who brought it in. The porter assumed it had arrived with the morning correspondence. But this is not the first. Holmes examined the letter with narrowed eyes. Type of paper, coarse. Ink, diluted, likely an attempt to mimic older stationery. The phrase widow's weeds, Victorian and theatrical. And you say there were others? Dwire nodded. 3 other men who sat with me on the bench during a particular trial, all received similar warnings. Holmes lit his pipe, the smoke curling upward as his gaze remained fixed on the letter. And now, he murmured, 3 are dead and 1 has come knocking. 3, Dwire confirmed grimly. All my colleagues on the bench during the Delaney verdict in '87. Sir Edwin Tolbridge drowned in his own bath. Justice Combs fell from a railway platform. And Harold Graves was found hanged in his study, though no note was left behind. And each, Holmes said, had received a letter such as this? Dwire gave a single, deliberate nod. There was no official inquiry, he continued, and each death passed as accident or misfortune. But when I received my own letter, I could no longer believe in coincidence. I glanced at Holmes, who sat motionless, his features unreadable. The name Delaney stirred something faint in memory. Holmes spoke at last. Thomas Delaney, the dock worker accused of setting fire to the Godwin warehouse, which claimed the lives of 5 men. Yes, a volatile man, convicted on strong circumstantial evidence and hanged 6 months later. And the widows? Holmes asked. There were 4, all present during the trial. One of them, Moira Delaney, protested her husband's innocence to the end. Holmes's eyes gleamed with a distant light. 4 widows, 4 dead judges, and now a letter in black ink. The game, Watson, as they say, is very much afoot. Lord Dwire leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on some immaterial point beyond the fireplace, as though reaching back through fog to a tribunal of ghosts. It was the Delaney trial that has returned to haunt me, he said, his voice low and roughened with memory. The Godwin warehouse fire, Dublin, 1887. Holmes made no sound, but his fingers steepled under his chin. There were 4 of us on the bench, Dwire continued. Sir Edwin Tolbridge, Graves, Combs, and myself. The fire took 5 men's lives. It was said to have been arson, an act of vengeance by a dock worker dismissed weeks earlier. Thomas Delaney was his name. I noted a tension in the man's manner, as if the very speaking of the case drew old shadows closer. There were 4 widows left behind, all present in the gallery through the proceedings. It was a case that moved swiftly, some said too swiftly, but we believed the evidence was sound. Holmes raised an eyebrow. And yet now, in the space of a year, your 3 colleagues are dead. Dwyer's mouth thinned. And I, the last of the 4, have received the same omen. He was not an admirable man, Mr. Holmes, Dwire said, his voice tinged with an old judicial severity. Thomas Delaney had a history of insubordination. He was dismissed for striking a foreman. The warehouse fire occurred not 3 weeks later. And the evidence? Holmes asked. Dwire shifted. Circumstantial. A matchbox was found near the site, stamped with the insignia of his union. Witnesses claimed to have seen a man matching his build near the alley behind the warehouse on the night in question. And one in particular, a fellow labourer named Cullen, swore he heard Delaney threaten revenge, but no one saw him enter the warehouse. No one. And Delaney himself maintained his innocence to the end. Yet the circumstantial elements formed a damning mosaic. The jury took less than an hour. And his wife, Holmes asked. Moira Delaney. She stood throughout the trial. Never once sat, never wept. But when the sentence was passed, she said only, "You have buried the truth, and one day it shall claw its way out." I remember her words precisely. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Some truths do not rest easy, my lord, particularly when buried beside a gallows. Holmes rose and began pacing, hands clasped loosely behind his back, a sign I knew that his mind was moving swiftly. Sir Edwin Tolbridge died how? He asked, without turning. Drowned in his own bath, Dwire replied. He had a habit of reading while bathing. His housekeeper found him with the water still running, a book face down on the tiles. Curious, Holmes murmured. Justice Harold Graves was found hanged in his library. There was no note. His valet testified that he had been unwell of late, but there was no evidence of despair. And Combs fell from a platform at Dunlogare station. The coroner ruled it accidental, though he had no luggage and no known travel planned. Holmes paused by the window, the faint drizzle outside tracing ghostly trails on the glass. A drowning, a hanging, and a fall, he mused aloud. Different methods, yet one common element. Each man judged Delaney. Precisely, said Dwire, and each received a letter not unlike my own. Cryptic, unsigned, postmarked Dublin. Holmes turned to face him. Not accidents then, my lord. These were performances, staged acts in a drama not yet concluded. Holmes returned to his seat, his gaze sharpening. You said there were 4 widows. Do we know their names? Dwire nodded. Moira Delaney, of course. The others were Agnes Doyle, Bridget Hanrahan, and Siobhan Tully. All lost their husbands in the fire. And yet only one made protest, Holmes murmured. Only one questioned the verdict. To my knowledge, Dwire affirmed. The others vanished into silence. Some remarried. One was said to have taken ill. Holmes tapped his fingers once against the armrest. Curious, Watson, how silence can be the loudest indictment. He stood and turned toward the mantel. 4 women robbed of their husbands by flame, 1 hanged on their behalf, and now 4 judges extinguished in kind. He turned to Dwire with quiet finality. The scales are shifting, Lord Dwire, but not under law. Holmes walked to the corner where his files were kept, withdrawing a leather-bound ledger with the ease of long familiarity. He opened it not to read, but rather as a gesture of thought. There is something ceremonial in these deaths, he said. Drowning, hanging, falling, rituals masquerading as misfortune. And now, the veil, the letter, the phrase, widow's weeds. The symbolism is deliberate and layered, Dwire frowned. But surely, Holmes, no widow could orchestrate such elaborate acts. Do not underestimate the reach of grief, Holmes replied, especially when it binds itself to justice. A woman wronged may retreat, or she may transform. He closed the ledger with a snap. What if the widows did not vanish, but changed their names, shifted identities, moved as shadows through London or Dublin? One could easily have adopted the guise of another. Are you suggesting impersonation? I asked. Or collaboration, Holmes said. An alliance bound not by law, but by shared injury. He turned to Dwire. You are not being hunted, my lord. You are being judged. Again. It was late in the afternoon when Lord Dwire departed, his expression no less strained, though perhaps steadied by the knowledge that his fear had substance. Holmes stood long in thought after the door closed. 4 widows, he said at last, scattered, renamed, perhaps reinvented, one in the open, Moira Delaney, the others cloaked in silence. And where do we begin? I asked. With the one who never left the stage, Holmes said. Moira. He moved to his desk and began drafting telegrams, one to Belfast, one to an archivist in Dublin, and a third, I noted with interest, to Scotland Yard. The hunt begins, Watson, but unlike our usual adversaries, I suspect our quarry has already donned the costume of grief, and worn it so long it has become a second skin. I sensed then, as I had before, that we were not merely solving a crime, but unearthing a reckoning. Our journey to Northern Ireland was undertaken under a curtain of grey skies, as though the heavens themselves bowed in reverence to the grief we pursued. Holmes was uncharacteristically silent for most of the crossing, save for one remark. "It is not justice that travels swiftly, Watson, but guilt. Guilt finds new names and quiet cottages." Moira Delaney resided in a weather-worn house on the edge of a cliff, its stone facade marked by salt and time. She opened the door herself, pale and angular, her once striking features now drawn by solitude. She recognized Holmes at once, though she did not smile. "I know why you've come," she said. "It was only a matter of time." Holmes bowed gently, his tone almost tender. "We do not seek vengeance, Mrs. Delaney, only truth." She gestured for us to enter. The interior was sparse. Few photographs, no letters upon the mantel. Her eyes, though heavy with years, remained unflinching. "I loved him," she said simply, "but the fire took more than a husband. It took everything that could have proven he was innocent." Holmes studied her without interruption, his gaze lingering on a closed drawer near the hearth. "We may need your help," he said. Moira's answer came after a long silence. "Then I hope you tread carefully. Ghosts here do not rest kindly." Our next journey led us to a genteel estate on the outskirts of Bath, a place of quiet hedges and complacent wealth. Agnes Doyle had remarried a gentleman of means, one Frederick Bascom, whose manner was as bland as the furnishings that surrounded him. "She's gone to visit her sister in Paris," he informed us, offering lukewarm tea and a distracted air. "She's often restless in the spring." Holmes surveyed the parlour with faint interest. "And she left no forwarding address?" "She prefers her solitude. Correspondence unsettles her." Bascom smiled thinly, as though this were a point of pride. Holmes wandered to the writing desk. "Might I?" "By all means, though I assure you—" He paused mid-sentence as Holmes retrieved a scrap of paper wedged beneath the blotter. A name had been hastily scratched, then crossed out. Tully. Holmes folded the slip carefully. "Odd thing to write in such haste, is it not?" Bascom looked at him blankly. "I should like to see her garden," Holmes said abruptly. "A woman's garden says far more about her state of mind than her parlour." Outside, Holmes whispered, "She has not gone to Paris, Watson. She has vanished, or been helped to vanish. And not for the first time, I suspect." Holmes's inquiries led us to the Dublin asylum, where Siobhan Tully had once been committed. The institution's corridors echoed with footsteps and half-murmured recollections, though Siobhan herself was no longer among the patients. "She was discharged in sound mind," the superintendent told us. "About a year past, said she wished to be useful to the world again. We have no record of her subsequent residence." "And her visitors prior to discharge?" Holmes inquired. "Only one, a woman who signed the register as V. Hennessy." I saw Holmes's brow rise slightly at the name. "She claimed to be a cousin, though she visited only twice. A tall woman, dark-haired, with a theatrical air about her. Left no forwarding details." Later, outside the gates, Holmes stood in silence. "She vanishes into mist," he said finally. "Not a trace of lodging, employment, or correspondence. If she lives, it is beneath a different name. If not, then someone has silenced her." A cold wind passed between us. "And the cousin?" I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A shadow in borrowed lace, Watson. The first glimpse of our phantom, I think." In a poor district of East London, we found Bridget Hanrahan. Her address led to a narrow brick building, a shelter for women, plain in appearance but clearly run with determined hands. Bridget met us in a modest office, her hair tied severely, her expression guarded. "I remember the trial," she said before Holmes had fully introduced us. "And I remember each widow's face, The court gave us justice, or so they claimed. Yet you chose not to remarry, nor leave the city, Holmes observed. I gave my life to the broken, she replied, motioning to the rooms beyond. Some carry grief inward. I turned mine into utility. Holmes studied her closely. Do you know the whereabouts of Mrs. Doyle or Miss Tully? Bridget's lips thinned. I do not keep company with ghosts. Holmes walked slowly about the room, pausing near a wall of embroidered samplers. One bore the initials, VWH. A donor, he asked, too casually. Bridget gave a single nod. A patron from Dublin, years ago, no longer in touch. I could feel the current between them, tense, unsaid, dangerous. Should she write again, Holmes said evenly, do pass her our regards. Outside, Holmes murmured, she is loyal, Watson, but to whom? Holmes next secured access to the archives of the Inner Temple, where we requested a full transcript of the Delaney trial. The clerk, though helpful, seemed surprised when Holmes asked for a specific page range. I'm afraid those folios are missing, he said, likely a misfile from years past. Holmes took the remaining sheaf and turned each page slowly. No markings of damage, he noted. No signs of decay. Simply absent. He tapped the ledger. These pages contained Cullen's testimony, the only eyewitness. The clerk paled, but his statement formed the cornerstone of the conviction. Indeed, Holmes said softly. And now it vanishes, like the man who gave it. Back at Baker Street, Holmes laid out the documents across our table like relics of a dismantled truth. There is artifice here, Watson. Someone returned years later and removed only what might challenge the narrative. Not in anger, but in precision. I felt a cold unease settle in my chest. Not a widow's grief, Holmes said, but a playwright's revision. Using his private sources, Holmes obtained an early handwritten draft of Cullen's statement from the Irish Circuit records, one that had been archived before the trial. We placed it side by side with the surviving court copy. There, he said, pointing to a line. I saw a figure enter the alley but could not identify the face. The trial copy read, I saw Delaney enter the alley, his face lit by fire. I stared at the divergence. This was not a misquote. No, Holmes replied. This was forgery. The original was vague, inconclusive. Someone inserted certainty. And the man who gave it? Cullen died in a cart accident the month following the trial. Officially ruled accidental. Unofficially, convenient. Holmes leaned back, his eyes fixed on the two statements. One cannot rewrite justice, Watson, without first rewriting memory. Whoever orchestrated this wanted Delaney hanged, and buried the doubt with him. I could say nothing. My throat had grown dry. Someone, Holmes said, has been playing God. But their theatre was not confined to the courtroom. It is still in motion. A quiet exhumation, secured through Holmes's influence, revealed a chilling detail in the death of Justice Tolbridge. A residue found in the lungs and stomach lining was identified by Holmes's contact at St. Bartholomew's as a variant of bog heather oil, specifically Erica cinerea, found in Irish wetlands. It causes paralysis before death, Holmes said grimly, and it is virtually undetectable unless one knows to search. I was chilled to the bone. A plant of mourning, he murmured, and of vengeance. It was I who first noticed it, a faint monogram in the corner of a linen handkerchief in Bridget's shelter. V.W. Holmes's eyes lit with a sudden flame. V.W. Verena Wren. It appears we are not dealing with widows alone, Watson, but with an actress returned from oblivion. Would you like me to proceed with the next section, Section 4, Rising Tension? Excellent. Below is the full-length narrative script for Section 4, Rising Tension from Sherlock Holmes and the Four Widows of Dublin, written in the authentic tone and voice of Dr. Watson, continuing seamlessly from the investigation. It was upon a bitter Thursday evening, while returning from an errand on Holmes's behalf, that I first felt the disquieting sensation of being followed. The fog had rolled in thick from the Thames, curling along the cobbled lanes of Kensington like some silent, suffocating thing, and the gas lamps were but pale islands in an encroaching sea of grey. I had taken no uncommon route, and bore nothing of particular interest beyond Holmes's note to a solicitor in Chancery Lane. Yet as my steps echoed faintly along the damp stones, I became aware, first as intuition, then as certainty, that another tread matched my own at intervals, not quite accidental. I paused abruptly beneath a flickering lamp, hand upon the revolver I now carried habitually. Silence answered. No figure emerged from the mist, yet I felt eyes, calculating, watching. Upon reaching Baker Street, Holmes looked up from his desk without surprise. "You were followed," he said. "You did not lead them to us, I trust?" "No," I answered grimly, "though they were clever." He nodded. "Our inquiries have ceased to be archival, Watson. We now trespass upon a stage whose performers prefer the dark." That same night, Holmes drew my attention to a faint crease upon the envelope of a letter he had yet to open, a simple request from the Cambridge Library regarding a botanical inquiry he had feigned weeks prior. "Do you see the fracture along the gum?" he asked. "It has been steamed and resealed." He moved to his archive drawer and withdrew 2 files, only to halt. "Curious," he murmured. "The Doyle matter is gone, and so too is the case of the Moor Lane fire. Barely relevant to our present inquiry, yet both removed." "Someone wishes to understand what we know," I said. Holmes nodded. "Or what we suspect, which makes their next move inevitable. They must mislead or silence." He looked toward the fire. "Let us ensure, then, that we are neither easily misled nor silently removed." By morning, a telegram from Lord Dwire summoned us in haste. We found him pale and trembling, the contents of a parcel laid before him on the drawing-room table. "It arrived with the post," he said. "No name, no return. Only this." The parcel contained a length of fine black lace, tattered and faintly perfumed, and a burnt scrap of parchment bearing the words, "Moira was not alone." Holmes examined both with care. The veil is Irish, hand-stitched, at least 20 years old. The parchment, singed deliberately at the edges, not by accident, and the message, symbolic. Dwire sank into his chair. "They're toying with me." "Not merely toying," Holmes said, his voice low. "They are building towards something. Each act is ceremonial." He folded the veil carefully. "There is meaning in every thread, every pause. These are rehearsals for a final act." "And what part shall I play in it?" Dwire asked bitterly. Holmes looked at him gravely. "That, my lord, may depend upon whether you walk willingly into the next scene, or we rewrite the ending ourselves." Back at Baker Street, Holmes stood before the fireplace, his brow furrowed. "There is a symmetry in all this, Watson. 4 widows, 4 judges. Yet the acts do not feel plural. They feel singular. You believe it is the work of one person." "Perhaps," Holmes said, "or one directing the hands of others." He turned to me. "Moira may be innocent, or a pawn, but it is equally possible she has lent her name to another, one who assumes other faces, other roles. We may not be hunting the widows at all, Watson. We may be hunting a ghost who wears their grief as costume." He looked once more at the burned message. "Someone is weaving vengeance into theatre, and we are now part of the audience." We returned to Moira's cottage under the pretense of seeking clarification on the trial. But in truth, Holmes had observed too much absence in her silence and sought the space between words. She greeted us with faint surprise, her eyes bloodshot and a handkerchief clutched tightly in her sleeve. Her voice, though steady, held a tremor I had not noted before. "I did not expect you so soon," she said. We had further questions, Holmes replied with courteous gravity. "May we?" She nodded and led us inside. The house was untouched, yet I sensed a new disquiet. The window beside the hearth was latched differently, the teacups mismatched, and on the writing desk, though covered hastily, rested a half-written letter addressed to an unfamiliar recipient. Moira herself moved as though under watchful eyes. She seemed older, thinner, and spoke only when pressed. Holmes made no accusations, yet his gaze missed nothing. He inquired gently about the veil, and she flinched. "I have worn none since the day he was buried," she said. Holmes said nothing, but I could see the shift in his posture. A quiet alertness, as though the performance had begun, but the actress had forgotten her lines. After our departure, Holmes asked me to record every detail I had observed. "There was a bruise," he said before I could begin, "just beneath her left wrist, not self-inflicted, and her shoes. Mud clung to them, but the garden was dry." He then produced the half-written letter he had managed to glimpse, reproduced from memory. The script is not hers. It bears none of the tremor, none of the rounded loops. Someone else wrote it, or coached her. And yet she said nothing, I murmured. "Because she fears," Holmes said simply. "Not for herself, but for someone she protects." He turned to his violin and ran a hand across its strings, though he did not play. "There was another cup set at the table," he added, "a faint indentation upon the cushion opposite hers, and a scent in the room, cypress and lavender, distinct from her usual soap." "You believe someone else is living there?" I asked. "No," Holmes replied. "I believe someone else is staging there." And with that, the music began, low, melancholic, and unfinished. That night, Holmes spoke only once as we sat in our study. "Someone is using her, Watson," he said, "not merely manipulating, inhabiting, taking her name, her letters, her silence. And I believe this spectre wears more than one face." I turned to him in alarm. "You think the same person could be impersonating more than one widow?" He nodded. "Yes. We are no longer chasing grief, Watson. We are chasing performance. And the actress has not yet taken her final bow." It was shortly after noon when the urgent telegram arrived. Lord Dwire's housekeeper, in trembling hand, reported a dreadful discovery. Her master unconscious in his study, the air thick with coal gas. We rushed to the residence in Kensington, arriving to find the constables already posted at the gate and a medical man administering brandy and salts within. The study door stood open, and I was at once struck by the heavy metallic taste of gas that still lingered in the air. The windows had been flung wide and the fire extinguished. Lord Dwire lay upon a chaise, his face pallid, lips tinged blue, and eyes flickering beneath closed lids. The constable in charge was a stout, unimaginative fellow named Harris. "Suicide attempt," he said with authority. "Gas tap fully open. Must have sat at his desk and waited for the end." Holmes said nothing at first, but stepped inside with the feline tread that marked his most focused mood. His gaze roved the room, over the desk, the overturned chair, the hearth rug. "I doubt that very much," he murmured. "There is too much order here, too little despair. This was not an attempt to end a life, but to erase it." Holmes crouched beside the desk, fingertips brushing over the green baize. "There is no pen, no ink, no note," he said. "No confession, no farewell. And yet, we are meant to believe the act was deliberate." He turned to the decanter of brandy, still full, 2 glasses beside it, one untouched, the other bearing the faintest trace of lip moisture. "The guest declined a drink," he said softly, "or perhaps never offered one." He rose and walked to the hearth. and the poker, untouched, though the room was cold. I saw then what he meant. Everything had been staged too neatly. No desperate clutter, no telltale signs of mental anguish. "It is a portrait," Holmes said at last. "A tableau painted for the authorities. But the brushstroke is too precise, and the artist too practiced." Holmes moved next to the gas jet, an ornate brass fixture mounted just above the skirting. He drew from his pocket a small glass slide and cloth and delicately swabbed the tap. "Just as I suspected," he said. "Wax, softened and used to block the flow until heated through. A crude yet effective timer." I watched, fascinated, as he scraped away a residue of amber film and held it up to the light. "A technique borrowed from the Irish insurgents of '85, he continued. "Used in booby traps and improvised devices. The wax seal would melt under the heat of the lamp, releasing gas only after a delay." He turned back toward the chaise, where Dwire still lay unconscious. He was meant to be found too late. The wax was his executioner. The constable shifted uncomfortably. "Then we'll treat it as attempted murder." Holmes arched a brow. "You may treat it as you please, Inspector, but understand, this was not a crime of passion nor of opportunity. It was calculated, rehearsed." He looked again at the wax. "And it was signed in a dialect few now speak, but one I begin to recognize." The window, though latched now, bore faint traces of condensation. Holmes leaned close, exhaled lightly against the pane, and angled it toward the light. "There," he said. "A palm print, small, delicate, likely female." We exited to the garden below, and Holmes knelt in the damp soil beside the base of the wall. With his usual precision, he took a measure from a small case and pressed gently into the earth. "A single boot print," he said. "Small, healed and shallow." She waited, perhaps watched. He stood slowly. She entered from the rear garden. The housekeeper was out. She tampered with the jet, ensured Dwire would be seated, perhaps offered tea or a letter, and departed. I shivered in the cool breeze. "You think she meant to kill him?" "I think," Holmes said, "she meant to send a message, and she nearly sent a corpse." It was hours later when Lord Dwire stirred. I had been watching his face for some time, and when the flutter of eyelids came, I summoned Holmes immediately. The magistrate coughed weakly, struggling against the oxygen mask. His eyes widened with panic, and I pressed his hand gently. "You're safe," I said. "You're at home." His breath rattled. He looked first at me, then at Holmes, and his voice came in a rasp. "She was already inside." Holmes leaned closer. "Who, Lord Dwire? Who was inside?" But Dwire had already closed his eyes, the strain overtaking him. He slipped back into unconsciousness, his brow lined with fear. Holmes stood in silence for a moment. "Already inside," he repeated. "Then our assassin does not only knock, she enters by invitation." He turned to me with sudden resolve. "She plays a longer game than I thought, Watson, and the curtain is only just rising." Later that evening, Holmes stood at the mantel, his violin untouched, the bow resting upon the shelf like an unspoken word. He did not speak at first. "This is no longer grief avenged by metaphor," he said finally. "It is now grief transfigured into action, into murder." "You believe she will strike again?" I asked. "I believe," Holmes said, "that she has already planned her next act." Dwire was nearly silenced, too close to something he recalled. "And we, Watson, may have stepped into view." His face was calm, but his eyes burned with a cold fire. "We must anticipate her stagecraft. She thinks theatrically. Her crimes are not only executions but performances, each clue left like an epilogue." He moved toward his desk. "We cannot afford to miss her next line. because the next audience may include us. It was in the process of reviewing Dwyer's personal effects, returned to him prior to the attempt, that Holmes uncovered a curious relic. Within a tattered law text lay a folded playbill, browned with age and fraying at the edges. Holmes opened it slowly, his brow lifting. "The Queen's Theatre, Dublin," he read. "September 1885. He traced the list of performers. "Miss Verena Wren Hennessy," he murmured. I peered over his shoulder. "A name from your archives." He shook his head. "A name from the shadows. She vanished the year after Delaney's execution. No known family, no marriage, no obituary." He closed the paper with care. "She was noted for her impersonations," he added. "Could play queen and beggar alike, and often in the same evening." A silence fell between us. "It may be that we have misnamed our villain Watson," he said at last. "She is no widow. She is a player." Holmes remained quiet for some minutes, turning the playbill over in his hands as though it might, under the right light, reveal its secrets. "VWH," he said softly. "We have seen these initials more than once, on cloth, in margins, upon fragments. Not Moira, not Bridget, not Siobhan." He looked up at me. "This has all been misdirection, Watson. A quartet of widows cast as villains, but the true hand has only ever worn one face." He rose swiftly. "Not vengeance by committee, but vengeance by actress. An illusionist of grief. One who directs the players, writes the script, and remains unseen behind the curtain." "And the motive?" I asked. He stared toward the window, where the fog curled like a drawn curtain. "She was sister to Moira Delaney, and perhaps something more to Thomas himself. When he died, she lost more than blood. She lost purpose." He turned to me with cold clarity. "And now, she performs revenge." Holmes sat motionless for some time after the discovery of the playbill, the tip of his index finger tapping gently against his chin. The fire had long since dimmed in the hearth, yet his gaze burned with quiet intensity as he stared into the smouldering coals. "Watson," he said at length, "we have erred not in direction but in focus. The string of initials, VW, has appeared too many times to be incidental. But it was never Moira, never Bridget, never any of the widows we have pursued." He rose and fetched a worn directory from the bookshelf, leafing through it with deft fingers until he paused at a familiar name. "Verena Wren Hennessy," he read aloud. "A name of theatrical grace, once admired in the salons of Dublin. She vanished in 1887, shortly after the trial that condemned Thomas Delaney." I was struck by the name. "You believe she is behind it all?" "I believe," said Holmes, "that we have been watching the shadows while the true performer occupied centre stage." He closed the volume softly. She was praised for her talent at transformation, beggar, duchess, child, and now, widow. He turned to me, eyes cold. "We are no longer pursuing grief, Watson. We are pursuing theatre." The next morning, Holmes unfolded a small dossier of birth records, clippings, and theatre reviews compiled in haste, yet presented with the usual order of his mind. "Verena Wren," he began, "born to a Miss Hennessy, a seamstress in the employ of the Delaney household. 4 years later, that same household recorded the birth of Moira Delaney." He laid 2 faded portraits side by side, one clipped from a playbill, the other a photograph taken at Delaney's funeral. The resemblance is faint but deliberate. Enough, I dare say, to imply a familial link. "A half-sister?" I ventured. Holmes nodded. "And more than that, a dramatist of vengeance. While Moira grieved, Verena vanished. While the widows lived in shadow, she moved among them, adopting their faces, their voices." He folded the dossier closed. "Moira mourns, but Verena directs." It was 3 days later when Holmes put into motion the final act of his design. Through a network of intermediaries and borrowed names, he arranged a modest but publicly noted commemoration of the Dublin warehouse fire, a gathering of sympathy and reflection to be held at a quiet Irish Cultural Society hall in Bloomsbury. The invitations, I learned, were carefully tailored, each one worded so as to appeal to the sensibilities and histories of the widows. Agnes Doyle is invited under her married name, Holmes explained. Bridget Hanrahan as a patroness of charity, Moira Delaney as a guest of honour, and for the fourth, the trap is baited with memory, not name. I looked at him in surprise. You expect her to come? She will not resist, Holmes replied. This is not a confrontation. It is a performance, and she has never missed an opening night. The appointed evening arrived with drizzle and fog, and we took our positions as agreed. I was seated in the hall, disguised only by the quiet modesty of my overcoat and the dim lighting within. Holmes, meanwhile, remained unseen, disguised in scholar's robes and tinted spectacles, loitering near the rear wall. The hall itself was sparsely filled. A mournful Irish air played on a harp in the corner. The names of the dead were read aloud in solemn voice, followed by moments of silence that hung heavy upon the walls. Then, one by one, they arrived. Moira, thin and hollow-eyed. Bridget, stoic. Agnes, her features subtly altered by time and affectation. And a fourth, veiled and silent, seated alone near the back. I watched them carefully. Not one exchanged words, yet in their stillness there pulsed something more urgent than grief, recognition, or fear. A strange theatre indeed, in which every actor hides from the script. Halfway through the remembrance, a recitation of an Irish ballad dedicated to lost labourers, I saw a motion near the rear door. The veiled woman, who had said nothing and drawn no attention, rose without sound and moved discreetly through the shadows of the corridor. I turned to glance toward Holmes, but he was already gone. Later, he would recount what I could only imagine. Dressed as a lecturer, he had kept to the perimeter of the hall, noting not only the four widows, but their manner of sitting, of listening, or not. And when that fourth woman slipped away, he followed. She walked without hesitation, he would later tell me, down the alley, past the theatre posters, into the fog, not as one fleeing, but as one exiting a stage, costume removed, role concluded. He paused before adding, but the curtain, Watson, had not yet fallen. It was in a narrow passage behind the cultural hall that Holmes at last intercepted her. She turned at his step, not startled, but poised, as though expecting her cue. In her gloved hand, wrapped in a folded swatch of violet silk, was a small glass vial, its contents pale and viscous. Beneath it, a slender blade lay sheathed in mother of pearl. I wondered how soon you would arrive, she said softly. Holmes said nothing. He merely extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she relinquished the bundle without resistance. This is not murder, she whispered. It is catharsis. But Holmes remained silent still. They stood in silence, fog curling between them like theatre smoke. I am Verena Wren Hennessy, she said at last, as if admitting a part long played. Sister to Moira, mournful child of injustice, and playwright of the judgment the courts denied. Her voice bore no defiance, only the calm certainty of one who had rehearsed every syllable. I watched them bury Thomas. I watched them forget, but She touched her breast. I remembered, so I gave them remembrance in return. Each death a soliloquy, each token a line in my script. She looked at Holmes with neither rage nor regret. Now the play is done. Verena Wren sat with unnerving composure in the dimly lit interrogation room, the iron cuffs around her wrists seeming no more than an afterthought to her. She was not the picture of fear, nor the reflection of guilt. Instead, she sat with the stillness of a woman who had long since come to terms with her fate. There was neither defiance nor submission in her posture, simply a calm acceptance, as though this moment, this arrest, was as inevitable as the rising of the sun. Her eyes, steady and calculating, met mine across the table, and I felt the weight of her quiet certainty press into the silence between us. The rest of the constables had long departed, leaving her to the mercy of Holmes and his piercing gaze. But there was no mercy in her. Only the cold, unyielding mask of someone who had already played their part, and now waited for the curtain to fall. She regarded me with an unreadable expression as I sat across from her, my pen poised but unmoving in my hand. There was a curious absence of any emotion, no panic, no regret, just a deliberate stillness that filled the room. "It is done," she murmured quietly, almost to herself. "I have played my role, and now it ends." Her voice, when she spoke again, was calm, almost reflective, as though she had been waiting for this moment all along. "I had to be subtle with Moira," she explained, her gaze falling to the tabletop. "She was fragile, and her grief, it blinded her to everything. I used it. I played upon her sorrow, upon her love for her late husband, and I convinced her he had been wronged." She paused, as though considering her own words. "I made her assist me without her knowing. Letters were sent under her name, names were provided. Small things at first, insignificant, harmless. She never knew how much she was truly aiding me, never saw the web I was weaving around her." I leaned forward, intrigued by her chilling confession. "And you used her as a pawn?" A slight smile touched her lips, but there was no warmth in it. "She was never the true player, Dr. Watson. She was simply the stage on which I performed my act." Verena's next words came slowly, methodically, as though she were reciting a well-rehearsed monologue, one that had taken years to perfect. She seemed no longer to be the woman sitting in the chair, but rather the very embodiment of the roles she had played over the years. "I was no stranger to disguise," she began, her voice dropping into a tone of eerie detachment. "I became the ghost of Agnes Doyle, Siobhan Tully, and even the nurse who tended to one of the judges in his final days. Each identity was a step closer to my vengeance, a vengeance not on the man alone, but on the system that had sentenced Thomas to death." Her hands clasped tightly before her, as though to hold on to the very essence of her next words. "I administered poison under the guise of care, slipping it in unnoticed. Each death was carefully timed, like the opening of a new scene in the theatre of my making." I felt the room grow colder with the weight of her confession, the realization of how much suffering had been orchestrated from the shadows. Her quiet voice, the only thing holding together the wreckage of lives she had so artfully destroyed. "I was not merely avenging a husband," she added softly. "I was correcting an injustice that no court would ever see." As she spoke, I found myself caught in a strange dissonance. There she sat, her eyes still distant, as though the crimes she described were mere acts in a play. To her, there was no bloodshed, only a calculated performance, one she believed was justified by some higher moral code. "The court judges evidence," she said, her words precise. "But it is not evidence that weighs most heavily on the soul, Dr. Watson. It is the grief, the lingering ache of a wrong uncorrected. That, in my view, is where true justice lies." I watched her carefully as she continued, her words dripping with cold clarity. She did not see herself as a murderer, nor as someone who had waged a personal vendetta. She saw herself as a performer, casting herself in the role of righteous avenger, and those who had died as mere players in a tragedy that had been long overdue. "This was not vengeance," she concluded with chilling certainty. "This was justice in its purest form, an act of redemption, not for Thomas Delaney alone, but for all the innocents who suffer at the hands of men in power. Holmes entered the room then, his presence silent but unmistakable. He took a seat opposite Verena with his usual poised composure, his sharp eyes never leaving her face. "I am not here to extract further confessions, Miss Wren," he said quietly. "You have already told us what we needed to know. But what I seek, what I truly wish to understand is this: why?" She regarded him for a long moment, her face still, her eyes searching his as though trying to gauge his thoughts. "Why?" she echoed, her voice filled with something akin to amusement. "Because the world does not care, because the courts will not listen, and the guilty go free. It was my only recourse." Holmes nodded, his gaze steady. "But why perform it as a play, as a scripted act? Why not simply end it?" Her lips curled slightly. "Because, Mr. Holmes, I wanted them to know they were wronged. I wanted them to remember my name and what I did. I wanted them to hear the final act, to witness the curtain fall." Her final words were a poem, one I had never heard, yet it carried the weight of a mournful history. "The law judges with evidence, but the heart sees all," she quoted, her voice soft yet commanding. "Grief knows no statute, and vengeance wears no chains." Holmes leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think grief and vengeance are the same thing?" She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Yes, they are the same, Mr. Holmes. Justice is not a matter of legal process. It is about redressing wrongs, balancing the scales of sorrow with those of retribution. The law punishes those who have done wrong in the eyes of society. But I, Mr. Holmes, punished those who wronged the soul." There was a haunting resonance in her voice as she spoke, a bitter kind of poetry to her reasoning that made even the cold logic of Holmes pause for a moment. Her final words lingered in the air like a silent, unspoken verdict. The fog had thinned considerably upon our return to Baker Street, yet within our sitting room, a deeper haze lingered in the silence that enveloped my companion. Holmes, who ordinarily relished the unravelling of his investigations with an almost theatrical flourish, now sat motionless, his fingers pressed thoughtfully together beneath his chin, eyes distant and withdrawn. After a long pause, I ventured quietly, "Holmes, the conclusion is clear, yet I confess the threads still elude my grasp. Will you not share the entire truth?" He stirred from his abstraction, meeting my eyes with a measured intensity. "My apologies, Watson," he replied quietly. "The case weighs upon me in an unusual fashion. Justice, it appears, carries shadows of its own." He rose slowly, gathering papers and notes before settling back into his chair and turning his piercing gaze towards me. "Let us then revisit it together, my friend, one final time." Holmes began by carefully unfolding a slip bearing the familiar initials. V.W. It was here, Watson, that the puzzle began to unravel. Those initials were more than mere letters. They were signatures, statements of identity. He glanced toward the flickering fire. Verena Wren Hennessy, actress, illusionist, one who vanished just after the trial. Her absence was no coincidence, nor was her resurfacing accidental. Her initials threaded through every clue, every note, every subtle reminder of loss. I listened attentively, absorbing the clarity with which he retraced each step. Her stagecraft provided the perfect mask. What better disguise than that of grief itself? Each act of revenge was marked subtly, quietly, yet distinctly, with her initials embedded within her symbolic mourning. Holmes paused, reflecting. She signed her vengeance, Watson, and that became the silent script which directed my suspicion, and eventually led me to her final act. Holmes leaned forward, producing a map dotted with careful annotations. Each letter, each threat, originated from a postal office situated deliberately near centres of Irish culture. It was not merely convenience, It was design. He tapped the map softly with his finger. These places were stages in themselves, Watson, chosen to invoke national pride, sorrow, sentiment, to mask the letters as acts of mourning rather than threats of murder. Verena understood theatre intimately. Every performance demands an audience receptive to its message. I began to see clearly how each detail formed part of a grander tableau. She knew precisely how her recipients would react. Men of power fear anonymous voices, more so when those voices resonate with the grievances of an entire community. She chose locations steeped in Irish history, each letter thereby steeped in unspoken meaning. Holmes paused, his eyes briefly shadowed. This was not mere cruelty, it was an appeal, a theatrical cry for acknowledgement. She sought not only revenge, but recognition, an audience forced to confront the tragedy of injustice, amplified by symbols that spoke directly to their own conscience. He sat back, sighing deeply. It was vengeance delivered through poetry, Watson, and thus twice as potent. Consider next, Holmes continued evenly, the means by which she executed her design. The poison derived from Irish bog heather, the wax-timed release of gas, even the mourning garments and charred messages. Each was meticulously staged. He held up the small vial recovered earlier. This heather poison, subtle and difficult to detect, was both symbolic and practical, a silent killer tied explicitly to Irish soil. The wax delay on the gas tap was a trick drawn from revolutionary tactics, a nod towards rebellion, yet executed with theatrical precision. His voice softened slightly, acknowledging the unsettling beauty of her planning. Every detail was orchestrated, every death a crafted performance. Poison as silent as whispers behind stage curtains, gas lingering in the air like applause after a final act. I felt myself shudder slightly at the calm intensity with which he dissected her actions. The mourning veil, the scraps of burned parchment, these were props, each chosen to evoke grief, each death echoing the injustice suffered by her sister's husband. Her victims did not merely die, they witnessed in their final moments the stagecraft of her justice. Each murder was, in essence, her own requiem for innocence lost. I found myself deeply unsettled by Holmes's revelations. For Verena's revenge was draped not in simple malice, but in the compelling guise of empathy. Her acts, executed through symbols of sorrow and loss, seemed perversely justified, carrying an unsettling authenticity. I spoke haltingly. It is a strange and fearful thing, Holmes, that grief could be wielded as a weapon. Holmes nodded solemnly, his eyes contemplative. Precisely, Watson. She used mourning not simply as a disguise, but as justification. Her victims saw not an assailant, but a reflection of their own guilt. In their final moments, they glimpsed the sorrow they had wrought, believing it genuine. I felt a chill as he continued. She forced empathy upon them even as she exacted retribution, an executioner wrapped in widow's weeds. He met my troubled gaze steadily. She was cunning, Watson, because she understood the most powerful illusions mirror the deepest truths. I hesitated before asking, "When did you first suspect her?" Holmes's features softened momentarily, as though recalling a distant applause. "It was when I learned of her past, Watson. An actress once famed for her transformations on stage, praised widely for her mastery of disguise. Her reputation was legend, her impersonations flawless." He turned his gaze toward the fire again. An actress of her talent could easily assume the role of widow, nurse, friend. It was this knowledge that first unsettled me, planting the initial seed of suspicion. Her applause was well earned, yet dangerous, for it revealed her greatest skill. He fell silent briefly, then murmured softly, almost to himself. Her performances were her weapons, her audience, her victims. The moment I realized this, I knew precisely the shape our investigation must take. His eyes were somber as he concluded, and that path led us inexorably back to her. We sat in thoughtful silence, the only sound the quiet crackling of the fire. I confess the weight of the case pressed heavily upon me, not merely for what Holmes had uncovered, but for what we could never undo. "It troubles me still, Holmes," I admitted quietly. "We solved the mystery, but I cannot shake the deeper sorrow, the lives lost, the injustice buried beneath these years of bitterness." Holmes sighed softly, his voice weary yet understanding. "Indeed, Watson, beneath the logic, beneath the revelations, lies tragedy. Verena sought vengeance, yet justice, true justice, remains forever elusive. The law may pass sentence, but it cannot heal the wound left by human error." His voice was gentle, almost philosophical, as he concluded, "We are detectives, not healers. We see clearly, but we cannot alter the past. And perhaps that is our greatest burden, to see tragedy clearly, yet remain powerless to erase it." I pondered his words, feeling their weight settle upon my own heart. He rose slowly, placing a reassuring hand upon my shoulder. "Come, Watson, let us leave this case to history, and hope that we have at least brought some truth to light." The evening had settled deeply over Baker Street, bringing with it a quiet melancholy that hung palpably between Holmes and myself. My notebook lay open upon my lap, untouched, as I pondered the shadows cast by our recent ordeal. Finally, no longer able to silence the unrest in my heart, I broke the heavy stillness. "Holmes," I began softly, my voice betraying an unusual hesitation, "I must ask you plainly, do you believe true justice has prevailed?" Holmes lifted his head slowly, his grey eyes piercing in their intensity. For a moment he did not reply, simply regarding me with that unfathomable gaze which always bespoke a mind turning rapidly behind a carefully impassive countenance. "You speak of true justice, Watson," he said quietly at length. "But what is true justice? Is it measured merely by law, by the evidence carefully weighed and recorded? Or is it found in a deeper balance, one that seeks to mend the heart as well as punish the hand?" His voice lowered thoughtfully. "We have captured a criminal, certainly. Yet I wonder still if we have addressed the deeper wrong that brought her to act." Holmes leaned back into his chair, his hands forming a steeple before him, fingers lightly touching in thought. "Justice, Watson," he continued reflectively, "is seldom as pure as we would hope. Too often it arrives belatedly, long after the echoes of grief have faded, and even then it frequently appears theatrical, dramatized by our need for resolution rather than a perfect understanding of truth." I nodded, sensing that he wished not to argue but to illuminate a broader reflection. "You see, the tragedy of cases like Verena Wren's lies precisely in the distortions wrought by memory and sorrow. She acted not merely from vengeance, but from a grief transformed into obsession. The law has now judged her, yet who will judge the circumstances that twisted her heart?" He paused, his voice softening. "Time shapes justice as much as truth itself, and often justice, true, undeniable justice, reveals itself only after it has been marred beyond recognition by human frailty." Holmes's eyes flickered briefly with a sorrow I rarely glimpsed in him. "Thus we conclude not with clarity, my dear Watson, but with the weary understanding that justice is more elusive than deduction itself." Holmes turned his eyes toward the dying embers in the hearth, their faint glow illuminating his angular features. His next words came quietly, their meaning heavier than I had expected. "The law may bury its errors, Watson," he murmured, "but grief does not forget. It merely changes costume. I reflected silently upon this haunting metaphor. Indeed, Verena's elaborate masquerade of mourning had not concealed but rather amplified her sorrow, turning grief into something perilously akin to justice itself. The image haunted me. Grief that wore 100 faces, shifting and elusive yet ever present beneath each mask it donned. Holmes's words lingered in my mind, and I knew he spoke not only of Verena's grief, but of something deeper within all human hearts. A sorrow we carry hidden beneath the guise of acceptance, understanding, or even justice itself. I watched as Holmes rose quietly and moved to the window, standing silent and motionless against the dim, flickering gaslight. Beyond the glass, the familiar London fog twisted and coiled like a living thing, rising and falling in waves of pale obscurity. It struck me then how fitting an image it provided, an outward reflection of our own tangled thoughts, unresolved questions, and lingering sorrow. Holmes stood, silhouetted against the murky twilight, observing the mist as though it whispered back to him some secret truth we had not fully grasped. The case had ended, yet the fog within us lingered. I realized with sudden clarity that Holmes himself, for all his precision and insight, saw in that shifting haze a mirror of the complexity of human pain and uncertainty, a complexity even he, in all his remarkable clarity, could not fully resolve. As I observed Holmes, my admiration was tempered with quiet melancholy. For all his genius, his meticulous logic, and peerless insight, even he was incapable of mending the damage wrought by injustice. He could illuminate the hidden threads, reveal the truth woven into dark patterns, but he could not unweave the harm already done. I understood then, perhaps more clearly than ever before, the great paradox of our vocation. Holmes's gift lay in uncovering truths hidden from sight, yet some truths once revealed left us only with the bitter knowledge of irreparable harm. My reflections grew somber. "Holmes," I said gently, though mostly to myself, "your work can illuminate, but not always heal." He turned slowly towards me, his expression calm, yet profoundly understanding. "Precisely, Watson. That is our burden, to see clearly what cannot be undone." With quiet deliberation, Holmes turned from the window, crossing the room slowly to where his violin rested upon the table. He lifted it gently, almost reverently, settling it beneath his chin with a quiet dignity. A moment later, his bow began to draw across the strings, conjuring a melody I had never before heard him play. It was neither triumphant nor consoling. Rather, it was somber, poignant, and strangely incomplete, a musical expression of the unresolved questions that hovered still between us. I listened silently, feeling the notes swirl and linger within the gloom of our room, an elegy played in honor of lost innocence, quiet grief, and elusive justice. The final strains echoed faintly into silence, yet the haunting melody seemed never truly to end, hanging suspended in the shadows, much like the sorrow and mystery that forever danced beyond our grasp in the uncertain fog of Baker Street. Holmes sat quietly, his long fingers pressed thoughtfully together as he gazed into the fading embers of the fire. After a prolonged silence, he spoke softly, his voice carrying the calm certainty that always accompanied his deeper insights. "You see, Watson," he remarked quietly, "vengeance, though cloaked in grief, remains but another mask of injustice. It blinds even the keenest eyes and turns the victim into the very thing they despise." He paused, reflecting for a moment before turning toward me. "Yet one question intrigues me still, my friend. When precisely did the criminal's performance slip, revealing her true identity? Perhaps our listeners might discern that pivotal moment. Indeed, dear listeners, what do you think gave away the criminal's carefully staged deception? Share your thoughts below. I am eager to read your deductions. And remember, If you've enjoyed unraveling this mystery with us, subscribe for more intriguing Sherlock Holmes adventures and share the story with friends and family who appreciate a thoughtful puzzle.